Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about memory. Memory is one of the coolest chapters to study because by the time you're done, hopefully you're more confused than when you started. And again, this is the intriguing part about psychology is the more you study, the more you find there is more to study. And the more you think you know, then you delve into some other areas and it turns out you need to know a whole bunch of more stuff. So if I say something like your memories are nothing but neurons, and at first, you're going to be like, what exactly does that mean? I'm saying your memories are nothing more than cells releasing neurotransmitters to communicate with each other. When you get a little bit further, you start saying things like your memories are nothing more than your cells, your neurons, organized into schemas, categories of knowledge that can be retrieved along neural pathways. And so when you're retrieving a memory, when you're remembering something, what's actually happening is you are retrieving a neuron talking to another neuron to put an impression in your mind of that memory that you once had. And when you start thinking about things like this, it's very complex. So when I say something like memory is retention of information, or another word for retained information is knowledge. And so if I say something like your knowledge is nothing more than your neurons releasing neurotransmitters, and again, that's where you start to be like, okay, hold on a second. So all of my knowledge is just neurons releasing neurotransmitters. And I'm saying, yes, that's exactly how it works. Our brain has organized these neurons into systems, memory systems. These memories can be retrieved by signaling specific neurons to then send impressions back to your brain for you to think about. Again, it's incredibly complex, but this is why it's really cool. Because when I say something like your identity, who you are as a person, is really just a bunch of neurons releasing neurotransmitters. It's really just memories, experiences of who you are as a person. That is really intriguing. So, yes, do you have a genetic self, a biologically influenced self? Absolutely. Your unconscious mind is driving you. So much of who you are is an unconscious process. It's your body, it's your genetics. Absolutely. But again, so much else of who you are is your experiences and your memories of those experiences and how you perceive those experiences, along with, of course, how variables in the social context like race, sex, gender, culture, religion, etc., also influence the way you think. But again, your experiences of interacting in the social context compounded with your genetic self, your biological self, your unconscious self, that becomes who you are as a person. But again, who you are as a person is highly influenced by your memories of being yourself. Therefore, let's say you have a stroke in certain parts of your brain, you might lose that sense of self. Like if you have a stroke in your left side of the brain that's responsible for thinking you're separate, you're a separate identity from everything else that's out here, all of a sudden you might feel connected to the air and you might lose that sense of identity because you had a stroke in the left side of your brain because the memories that are stored here of being separate and independent are gone. Same thing happens with Alzheimer's. If you have memories that are stored here for your, family's name, and then you have some degrading in this area of your brain, then all of a sudden those memories that are permanently stored are gone and can no longer be accessed. But again, those memories that are gone are essentially just neurons. Those neural pathways have somehow burnt out. That interstate in our head that imagine like your memories are like cities on a map, and what connects these memories, these neural pathways are like interstate systems, okay? And so it's a lot like that. If you have like a burnout in the interstate that leads you from like Columbus to Cincinnati, for example, you can no longer get from Columbus to Cincinnati via the interstate because maybe like the bridge is out or something like that. And then you have to take an alternative route, maybe. But again, that road that went from Columbus to Cincinnati is no longer there. So that road that leads from like your memory of your children's names, for example, is no longer there. You've lost the ability to retrieve that memory, or that memory is gone because that part of the brain that held that memory might have eroded in some kind of way. So again, when you start to look at memory and brain damage and certain issues like that's some of the areas you're going to be looking at. So again, that's just a quick introduction to get you excited about memory. And the idea is memory is nothing more than retained information, which, knowledge is retained information, knowledge of who you are that's been stored over time, for example. And that, and then, okay. So memory is defined simply as learning over time encoding, storing, and retrieving information. Okay? So again, all your memories come through experiences, all your knowledge, all these stored memories are learned through experience. Okay. So the important words when it comes through memory, we're going to be thinking about is encoding. How do we code that information in our brain? For example, when you're a baby, the reason you can't remember anything prior to like age 3 is because once you learn language, you started encoding your memories different than you did when you were a baby. Therefore, the memory cues that you had to retrieve those memories from when you were a baby are gone. So you still have the memories of being a baby in your mind. However, you can't access them because you've lost the memory cue since you've developed language. And that's why for most of you, since you're like 3 or 4, that's when most of your memories start to come in. And that's because you can retrieve those memories through the use of language and semantics. Okay. So when we're talking about memory, we're talking about how those memories are coded and stored. Okay. And then how we retrieve them with memory cues. Okay, so there's 3 retention measures. There's recall, your ability to retrieve, recognition, your ability to identify, and relearning when you have to just, over time you continuously learn things. And the way I like to think about this is like when you try to remember a band, like you hear a song, right? So you're hearing the song, you're thinking about it, and you're like, who is this band? Who is this? And so you're trying to retrieve it. So you're searching through all your memories, trying to find the memory cue that leads you to the memory, okay? So you identify the song, you know who it is, then you can retrieve it, and then eventually it pops into your head. Oh yeah, that's Santana. Oh yeah, I knew that. And today I was listening to Whiter Shade of Pale, and I was like, who is that? And I had to think. I identified the song, but then I had to retrieve the memory of who wrote the song, and then I was like, oh yeah, Procol Harum. But I know Procol Harum because I've stared at that CD how many times and learned and relearned it over time. Okay. So there's 4 types of memory. The biggest ones are going to be short and long-term memory, but sensory memory is this. What's the last thing I said? And so that ability for you to remember the very last thing I said for a couple seconds, that's like your body's memory, your sensory memory. Okay, so all of us can remember everything that happened like in the last 5 seconds, but then 10 seconds from now it's gone unless it was important. Okay, so that's sensory memory. So whenever someone, you're like in a fight or you pretend you're not listening to somebody and they're like, well, hey, you're not listening. What was the last thing I said? You'll say, hey, you're not listening. What was the last thing I said? And that shows them that you were listening even though you really weren't. That's your sensory memory. Okay. Your working memory is your ability to use your short-term memories, which are temporary memories, and your long-term memories, permanent memories together. So for example, if I'm going to build a shelf, but I've built a shelf before I build the shelf, I might be thinking back onto my long-term memories like, okay, what tools did I need? What errors did I make last time? How can I make this better? And so you're trying to figure out how to solve a problem now, like build a shelf, but you're also using your memories of building shelves to help you do what you're trying to do in this moment. Okay, and that's the idea of working memory. And then your short-term memories are something like I give you a list of 7 numbers. You can memorize them for a few minutes, but then 10, 15 minutes from now, can you still memorize those numbers? So your short-term memory is, again, as it sounds short, it doesn't last as long. And then your long-term memories are those permanent memories. And the way memories works are all memories start out as short-term memories, and then we encode and store these short-term memories as long-term memories. Okay? So again, sensory memory is like your body's memory. What was the last thing you said? You have about 5 seconds worth of memory. Working memory is using your short-term memories, what you're doing in the moment with, and then comparing that to your long-term memories to make sense of what you're doing right now. Short-term memory is going to be temporary memory storage, and long-term memory is going to be permanent memory storage. And again, all memories go from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. Okay, so again, encoding is organizing information into our memory system. Again, we are organizing this information into schemas, categories, like skyscrapers of knowledge. So imagine your brain is like a map of New York City, and you just have skyscrapers of knowledge, schemas, all over your brain. That's where all your information is organized. And we use encoding tools such as language, or location, things along those lines to help us encode that information. And then storage is the ability to retain that information over time. Retrieval is the ability to retrieve or use a memory cue to gain access to that memory that's stored inside your brain. The problem is, none of you guys actually forget stuff. Our long term memory is permanent and it's an infinite capacity. The reason you forget the name of the band is you've lost that memory cue. But then if you think back to the room you were in when you were listening to that band and you start putting yourself back there, then all of a sudden, eventually, you'll remember the name of that band. Okay. So again, we use cues to retrieve information, but if we lose those memory cues, we tend to forget that information. Not that it's forgotten because it's in our brain, we just can't retrieve it anymore. Parallel processing is the idea that both your unconscious mind and your conscious mind memorize for you. So again, if I say, what color is the building you go to school in? You guys know the building color. You might not know how you know the building color. That's because you didn't consciously try to memorize it, but you know the building color. Okay? Think about the campus that you go to. Do you know how to get around? How much of it did you consciously learn? And how much did you just unconsciously learn just by wandering around and getting lost, for example? So again, you don't have complete control over what your brain memorizes for you. Again, your unconscious mind is taking in all kinds of stimuli, perceiving that stimuli, and then encoding what it chooses to memorize. And again, your brain does not encode everything. It's very selective about what it memorizes. But again, this ability to memorize is both an unconscious process, meaning your brain is doing it automatically for you. That's called implicit memory. And then you have conscious learning, effortful learning, that is called explicit. And then this is the idea that, for example, you guys all learn language automatically. It's an implicit process. You will unconsciously learn language, but reading requires work. It's effortful. It's hard. People don't in nature learn to read. Learning to read is a social construction, something that we have to teach and socialize from generation to generation. But learning language is an automatic process. So again, you unconsciously memorize language and grammar rules and syntax and phonemes and morphemes, but you don't unconsciously learn to read. You have to really work at it. But that's why school is hard, and that's why reading is hard for children and adults when you go to read, okay? It's not an automatic process. So again, our memories, like those interstates of a map, for example, connecting cities, are interconnected neural networks. Okay? Memory systems involve increasing synaptic neurotransmitter connections when you learn. And again, that's a complex way for saying your neurons are being organized into systems that then release neurotransmitters to, give you back your memories. Okay? So again, your memories are nothing more than neurons releasing neurotransmitters that have been organized, encoded, and stored over time that can be retrieved by using memory cues. Okay? So again, sensory memory, immediate encoding of information, visual, ears, okay? These are, sensation information, okay? So you can pick up what I just said. You might not understand what I just said. You might not have processed what I just said, but you remember what I just said. Okay? Short-term memory, again, brief or temporary memory storage. Long-term is permanent. Working memory is using your long-term memory and your short-term memories together. Okay? Explicit memory is conscious processing, like reading, it's hard. Implicit memory is what color is the building. It's automatic. You just know it. You just memorize it. You didn't even realize you were memorizing it, but you did. Okay. Effortful processing, again, another word for explicit, requires conscious, and automatic processing, implicit memory, is unconscious. Okay. To help you memorize things, there are a couple of ways to do this. One is chunking, grouping items together. So again, it's really hard to memorize a credit card number of 16 numbers, but if you break that up, chunk it into groups of 4, memorize the first 4, then work at that. Then memorize the second 4, then work at that. Then memorize the first and second 4 together. Then work on the third, then work on the fourth. And over time, you'll know that entire credit card number. So again, breaking big things into smaller pieces is one way to make memorizing easier. Mnemonics, like in music, every good boy does fine. Memory encoding devices, aids, every good boy does fine, okay? So that's how you learn it in music. Hierarchies. Your brain unconsciously and consciously, both implicitly and explicitly, will organize information into importance. And so it'll spend more time, more sugar rushes, more energy, um, breaking down things that your brain and your conscious mind, your unconscious and conscious mind finding more important than other stuff. Okay. So your brain hierarchically organizes information according to whether it thinks it's important. And then your conscious mind does the same thing. Spacing. Again, if you study for a test, instead of cramming for an hour one night, study for 10 minutes over 7 days. You're going to find that you'll do better if you just study a little bit every day for 7 days. Okay. Again, our long-term memory has infinite capacity, but the hard thing to do is to get that short-term memory into our long-term memory. Okay. Because it requires work, it requires energy. Okay. So your book talks about semantic memories, which are facts, skills, and knowledge, compared to episodic memories, like experience events in your life. Okay. There are a lot of brain structure at work when it comes to memory. Again, memories are stored all over your brain. Okay, so the hippocampus is very involved, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia are involved. I'm not going to make you guys memorize all of that. It's a little bit more upper level when we start to get into sensation and perception and cognitive psychology and neuroscience and really getting into brain structures. Again, this is just a quick introduction to all of that. Um, but to go on, our emotions are highly attached to our memory. So again, emotional experiences tend to get flashbulb memoried into our brain. We tend to rememorize these very intense emotional experiences. And a lot of this has to do with our biology, because when there's like an intense emotional experience, our bodies release glucose, sending sugar and energy to the brain to give it more energy to put these memories into long-term memory. Okay, so again, there's a rush of glucose that gives the brain energy, more energy to really focus on those emotional events and put them into long-term memory. So again, emotional arousal sears memories into the brain, hence the flashbulb memories that your book talks about. Okay, your book talks about priming. Priming is the idea that if I put something into your mind beforehand, then it just kind of sticks to you, and it tends to interfere with information and interfere with memory encoding. The encoding specificity principle says that cues and contexts are very important to memory. So again, where were you when you took it? For example, if you study and learn in a classroom, but then you go take a test in a different place, you tend to do worse than if you had taken the exam in the place that you actually studied and learned. Okay? And then the primacy and recency effect. Primacy effect is if I'm going to have you like memorize a long list, you're going to memorize the first words in the last part more than you will the stuff in the middle. So again, make sure you spend some time in the middle. So why do we forget? One major reason we forget is there's too much information. Imagine being a server in a restaurant. What would happen if you had permanent memories of every order you ever took? It can be completely overwhelming. And the best way to show you this is also this. Think of yourself in childhood. Where are you? What do you see around you? Who's with you? And all of a sudden, the memories start flooding back. The problem is, if you had a photographic memory, or your memory is broken a little bit, when you think about your past, you would get hit with the flood of memories. So your book talks about people with photographic memory and how that is more a curse. Because anytime they think of something, they get hit with all the flood of memories, and it's overwhelming. Okay, so it can be nonstop flood, uncontrollable, and exhausting to have a photographic memory. We need to forget stuff because there's too much information. Our unconscious mind is constantly taking in stimuli, all about the wind and the feel of the air, and whether it's hot or cold, and who's around you. And if you memorize all of that, you would just be completely overwhelmed. It's too much information. So there's a reason that evolutionarily we've developed a consciousness that can only think about one thing at a time. Because if we had to think about everything that's going on in our unconscious mind, that's, what it's like to be autistic. Again, their inability to focus and attend on something, hence an attention disorder. It means that when you're autistic, you're constantly bombarded with all the stimuli, and you can't just focus on one thing, and it's completely overwhelming. So if anyone's interested in that, I highly recommend studying it. The book also talks about anterograde versus retrograde amnesia. Anterograde is when you can't remember new events, like the movie Memento. He can remember everything before the trauma, but not after. And retrograde amnesia, less common, you can't remember your past. Okay? Memory failure results from encoding failure, like you coded your memories, but you're unable to retrieve them. Storage decay, like the neurons themselves are breaking down along with the neural pathways. Retrieval failure, you've lost your cue. Interference, something blocked your memory while you were storing it. Reconsolidation, your brain has reorganized its memories, and so it's lost some of the pathways. Okay? To improve your memory, rehearse repeatedly. Make the material meaningful, like when you actually care about what you're studying, okay? You tend to learn it better. Activate retrieval cues, like remember where you were, be in that place where you were studying, to start reflecting upon things. Mnemonic devices, minimizing interference, like try not to have music on and stuff while you're trying to learn. Sleeping is the most important thing for memory, along with eating. And then just test yourself. Okay, thank you so much. It's an honor.